Blake Thompson laughed the moment the simple woman asked about the Rolls-Royce. He didn't know it yet, but that laugh would cost him everything he thought he understood about power, money, and respect. The glass walls of Monarch luxury motors shimmered under the late afternoon sun on Chicago's North Shore, reflecting rows of polished vehicles worth more than most houses. Inside, the marble floor gleamed beneath bright showroom lights. Bentleys, Ferraris, and Rolls-Royces arranged like priceless sculptures. Customers in tailored suits walked slowly between them, sipping complimentary espresso while sales associates hovered nearby with practiced smiles. It was the kind of place where a car didn't just cost money, it announced who you were. That was exactly why Maggie Collins looked so out of place when she stepped through the tall glass doors. She wore faded blue jeans, a simple white t-shirt, and worn sneakers that had clearly seen better days. Her brown hair was tied back in a loose ponytail, and the only jewelry on her was a thin silver wedding band that caught the light for just a second as she pushed the door open. A few heads turned immediately, not with curiosity, with quiet judgment. At the center of the showroom stood Blake Thompson, the dealership's top sales manager, a man who prided himself on recognizing wealth the same way as sommelier recognized vintage wine. Custom navy suit, Italian leather shoes, perfectly styled hair. Blake believed he could read people in 3 seconds or less. When his eyes landed on Maggie, he made his decision instantly. Not a buyer. Not even close. Maggie walked slowly past a row of sleek black Bentleys before stopping in front of a silver Rolls-Royce Spectre positioned beneath a spotlight. The car looked almost unreal, its paint reflecting the ceiling lights like liquid chrome. A small tag beside it read $312,000. Maggie studied the car quietly, her eyes calm, thoughtful, almost curious, as if she were admiring a piece of art in a museum. Blake approached with the controlled smile he used for situations he considered a waste of time. "Ma'am," he said smoothly, stopping a few feet away. "If you're looking for pre-owned vehicles, there's another lot about half a mile down the road." Maggie turned slightly, meeting his eyes without irritation. Her voice was gentle but clear. "Actually, I wanted to ask about this one." She gestured lightly toward the Rolls-Royce. Blake blinked once, then let out a short laugh he didn't bother hiding. A couple standing near a red Ferrari glanced over. "This model starts just over $300,000, Blake said, emphasizing every word like he was explaining something obvious. Maggie nodded calmly. "Yes, I saw the price." She paused, then asked politely, "Would it be possible to see the interior?" For a brief second the room seemed to grow quieter. Blake looked her up and down again, slower this time, as if confirming what he already believed. The faint smile on his face sharpened. "People who buy these cars," he said casually, loud enough for nearby customers to hear, "usually come a little more prepared." A few soft chuckles drifted through the showroom. Maggie didn't react. Her expression stayed steady, almost thoughtful, as if she were measuring something far more important than the car in front of her. And somewhere deep in that silence, the moment that would change everything had already begun. Blake Thompson kept his polished smile in place, but inside he was already finished with the conversation. In his mind, the situation had been solved the moment Maggie Collins walked through the door in worn sneakers and denim. Monarch Luxury Motors was not the kind of place where people browsed for fun. Every customer who entered the showroom had usually scheduled an appointment, arrived in a luxury vehicle, or carried the quiet confidence of someone used to spending 6 figures without hesitation. Maggie, in Blake's eyes, matched none of those signals. She simply stood beside the silver Rolls-Royce Spectre, studying the smooth curve of the hood like someone admiring a sunset. For a moment, she gently placed her hand a few inches above the paint without touching it, almost respectfully. The movement caught the attention of Ethan Ross, one of the younger sales associates working the far side of the showroom. Ethan had only been at Monarch for 4 months, and unlike Blake, he had not yet mastered the art of judging customers in a single glance. From where he stood, he could see Maggie's expression clearly. She did not look confused or out of place. She looked thoughtful, the way someone looked when they were carefully deciding something important. Blake noticed Ethan watching and subtly shook his head, as if warning him not to get involved. Maggie finally turned back toward Blake with the same calm composure she had shown since the moment she walked in. "I understand it is an expensive car," she said politely, "but I would still like to see the inside if that is possible." Blake exhaled slowly through his nose, as if the request required patience he did not have. "Ma'am," he said, lowering his voice, but not enough to keep nearby customers from hearing. These vehicles are typically shown to clients who are prepared to make serious purchases. The couple near the Ferrari glanced over again, sensing the tension. Maggie tilted her head slightly. "Are you saying I cannot look at the car?" Blake gave a small laugh and spread his hands in a gesture that looked almost polite, but carried a sharp edge underneath. "I am saying this is not really a showroom for sightseeing." The words lingered in the air. Ethan shifted uncomfortably behind his desk. Maggie stood quietly for several seconds. She did not argue, and she did not raise her voice. Instead, she asked a single question, her tone gentle but steady. "If someone wanted to buy this car today, what would the process look like?" Blake glanced briefly toward the Spectre and then back at her clothing, clearly amused. "Most buyers begin with a deposit of $50,000, he replied. "And usually they arrive knowing exactly what they want." Maggie nodded slowly, as if committing the information to memory. Around them, the showroom lights reflected off the cars like small stars across the marble floor. The quiet hum of conversation returned among the other customers, but several of them still watched the exchange with curiosity. Blake checked the time on his watch, already turning his body slightly as though preparing to end the discussion. Maggie noticed the gesture but remained completely composed. "Thank you for explaining," she said softly. "That was helpful." Blake assumed the conversation was finally over. What he did not realize was that Maggie Collins had already decided something in that moment. Something that would bring her back to this same showroom less than 24 hours later, and when she returned, the entire room would understand just how badly Blake Thompson had misread the situation. Blake Thompson watched Maggie Collins for a moment longer, expecting her to walk away embarrassed like most people did when they realized they had stepped into a world far beyond their reach. Instead, she simply gave a small, polite nod, the kind someone gives after finishing a normal conversation. "Thank you for your time," she said calmly. Her voice carried no frustration, no defensiveness, only quiet certainty. That response surprised Blake more than if she had argued. Most people reacted emotionally when they felt judged. Maggie did not. She turned slowly and began walking toward the glass entrance doors, her worn sneakers making soft sounds against the polished marble floor. Several customers glanced at her as she passed, curiosity lingering in their eyes. Ethan Ross watched carefully from behind his desk. Something about the moment felt wrong to him, though he could not explain why. Maggie did not move like someone who had just been dismissed or humiliated. Her posture remained relaxed, her shoulders steady, her expression thoughtful. As she reached the doors, she paused briefly, glancing once more across the showroom at the silver Rolls-Royce Spectre beneath the spotlight. The reflection of the ceiling lights shimmered across its surface like ripples on water. For a second, her eyes rested on the car. Then she quietly stepped outside into the warm Chicago afternoon. The tall glass doors closed behind her with a soft click. Inside the showroom, the normal rhythm of business returned almost instantly. A salesman resumed explaining engine specifications to a couple examining a Bentley Continental. Another employee walked a client toward a dark blue Aston Martin parked near the center of the room. Blake adjusted the cuffs of his suit jacket and let out a faint chuckle. "Some people just wander in because they want to look at expensive things," he said casually to no one in particular. A few nearby employees nodded, though Ethan remained silent. He kept replaying the brief conversation in his mind. The calm way Maggie had asked about the car. The way she listened carefully when Blake mentioned the $50,000 deposit. The way she left without a single complaint. It did not feel like curiosity. It felt like someone gathering information. Ethan finally spoke quietly. She seemed serious about the car. Blake raised an eyebrow and looked toward him with amused disbelief. "Ethan, I have been selling luxury vehicles for 15 years, he replied confidently. "Trust me, I know the difference between a real buyer and someone daydreaming." He glanced toward the front windows where Maggie had disappeared moments earlier. "Real buyers do not show up looking like that." Ethan said nothing more, though a faint doubt lingered in his mind. Outside, Maggie walked across the wide parking lot toward a modest gray sedan parked near the far curb. The luxury vehicles surrounding Monarch Luxury Motors glistened under the late afternoon sun, their polished chrome reflecting the skyline of Chicago in the distance. Maggie opened the driver's door and sat inside for a moment without starting the engine. Her eyes rested calmly on the steering wheel, as if considering something carefully. Then she reached into her bag and picked up her phone. The screen lit softly in her hand. She typed a short message and pressed send. Somewhere across the city, a phone vibrated quietly on a polished wooden desk, and the person reading that message would soon make a decision that Blake Thompson could never have predicted. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the quiet visit Maggie Collins had made to Monarch Luxury Motors would no longer be a forgotten moment in a busy showroom. It would become the beginning of a lesson no one inside that building would ever forget. The tension backstage thickened with every passing minute as the muffled sound of polite applause from the recital hall faded into uneasy murmurs. Something had gone wrong. Lillian Porter could hear it even through the heavy green room door, the subtle shift in tone that only someone who truly understood music could recognize. Gregory Palmer's performance had ended sooner than expected, and the silence that followed carried none of the triumph Madame Du Bois had promised the donors. When the door suddenly opened, Professor Thornton stepped inside, his usually composed face tight with concern. Palmer froze during the final section. He muttered, almost to himself, completely lost the tempo. The words hung in the air like a cracked note. Across the room, Madame Du Bois stood rigid beside the piano, her silver hair immaculate, but her confidence clearly shaken. The donors had come expecting brilliance, the kind of moment that justified scholarships and prestige. Instead, they had witnessed hesitation, technical brilliance without soul. And in a place like the Robertson Conservatory, that kind of disappointment echoed loudly. Lillian remained near the wall, hands folded calmly in front of her simple navy dress, though inside her chest an old, familiar rhythm had begun to stir. 5 years. 5 years since she had last touched a concert piano in front of an audience. 5 years since she had walked away from the world that once applauded her name. She had come here precisely to escape that world, to exist quietly where no one expected greatness from a woman who sorted sheet music and brewed coffee. Yet fate, it seemed, had its own timing. Madame Du Bois suddenly turned toward the faculty gathered near the door, her voice sharp but edged with desperation. "The donors cannot leave remembering hesitation," she declared. "They must hear the list as it was meant to be played." The problem, of course, was obvious to everyone in the room. None of the remaining students were capable of performing the piece on such short notice. The transcription was too demanding, too explosive in its technical precision. Fingers needed not only strength, but memory carved through years of relentless practice. Professor Thornton glanced toward the silent piano, then toward the nervous cluster of students waiting in the corridor. One by one, they avoided his gaze. No volunteer stepped forward. The room filled with a long, uncomfortable pause. And in that pause, Madame Du Bois's eyes slowly drifted across the room until they landed on Lillian. For a moment, the older woman simply stared, as though recalling something half-forgotten. Earlier that morning Lillian had commented, carefully but accurately, about the difficulty of the transcription. At the time, Madame Du Bois had dismissed her words as impertinent curiosity from a staff assistant. Now the memory returned with unsettling clarity. "Miss Porter," she said suddenly, her voice quieter but filled with a strange curiosity. Every head turned. Lillian felt the familiar weight of attention settle onto her shoulders, something she had spent years avoiding. "Yes, madam," she replied gently. Madame Du Bois studied her for a long second, measuring something invisible. "You seem unusually familiar with this piece." Another silence followed, deeper this time. Professor Thornton frowned slightly, clearly confused by the direction of the conversation. But Madame Du Bois did not look away. "Tell me," she said slowly, "if someone truly understood Liszt, how would they play that final passage?" The question hung in the air like the opening note of a symphony. Lillian's eyes drifted toward the grand piano waiting just beyond the doorway. For a moment, the quiet assistant looked exactly as she always had. Simple, invisible, harmless. Then she took a slow breath, and something behind her steady eyes quietly awakened. The final chord from the earlier passage had not yet faded when Lillian Porter allowed the melody to breathe, her fingers hovering above the ivory keys with the calm patience of someone who understood that true music lived in the spaces between notes. The grand recital hall of the Robertson Conservatory had grown completely still. Conversations that had continued quietly only minutes earlier had vanished, replaced by a silence filled with attention. Donors who had been preparing to leave now sat upright again, their eyes fixed on the simple woman at the piano bench. Lillian resumed playing, her hands moving with effortless control across the keyboard as the demanding Liszt transcription unfolded exactly as the composer intended. The technical difficulty that had troubled Gregory Palmer only minutes before seemed to dissolve beneath her touch. Every scale rose like a clear stream of sound. Every chord landed with strength, yet never harshness. The architecture she had spoken about earlier revealed itself naturally through her phrasing, like a building slowly emerging from morning fog. Professor Thornton felt his breath slow as realization dawned in his mind. This was not merely someone familiar with the piece. This was someone who had lived inside it for years. Madame Du Bois stood frozen near the stage entrance, her sharp eyes widening as memory began assembling pieces she had long forgotten. The discipline in Lillian's posture, the confident lift of her wrists, the elegant patience in her tempo. These were not habits learned casually. These were the marks of a concert pianist trained on the world's most demanding stages. The final section approached, the exact moment where Gregory Palmer had lost control earlier in the evening. But under Lillian's hands the music did not rush. It gathered strength slowly, like a storm forming far out over the ocean. Her fingers traveled across the keys with measured authority, allowing every phrase to grow naturally until the final cascade of notes arrived with breathtaking clarity. The last chord resonated through the hall like a bell, rich and powerful, yet perfectly balanced. Then her hands lifted gently from the piano. For several seconds no one moved. The silence that followed was deeper than applause. It was the stunned quiet of an audience realizing they had just witnessed something extraordinary. One donor near the front row leaned forward, whispering softly to the man beside him, "I have heard that interpretation before, but it cannot be." Madame Du Bois took one slow step toward the stage, her expression now filled not with authority but with disbelief. Her voice, usually so controlled, carried a hint of astonishment. "Miss Porter," she said carefully, as if testing the name. Or perhaps, Lillian Hart? The name hung in the air like a forgotten melody suddenly remembered. Several faculty members exchanged startled glances. Lillian remained seated for a moment longer, her eyes resting quietly on the keyboard before she finally stood. She turned toward Madame Du Bois with the same gentle composure she had carried all evening. "Yes," she replied softly. "That was my name once." A wave of recognition moved through the room as the truth slowly settled into place. The quiet assistant who had been organizing sheet music and pouring coffee in the conservatory hallways was not an ordinary staff member at all. She was the pianist whose recordings had filled concert halls across Europe and North America years earlier, a performer who had mysteriously vanished from the public stage at the height of her career. And in that moment the entire room understood the same simple lesson. Greatness does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it sits quietly in the corner, waiting for the right moment to speak through music. The name lingered in the air like the final vibration of a piano string. Lillian Hart. For several seconds no one in the hall spoke, as if the audience needed time to adjust their understanding of the quiet woman who had just played with such breathtaking control. Madame Du Bois stared at her, the certainty now unmistakable. She had once attended a concert in New York nearly 8 years earlier where a young pianist named Lillian Hart had performed the exact Liszt transcription with a brilliance that critics described as rare even among elite performers. And now that same artist stood before her wearing a simple navy dress, working quietly as an assistant in the very conservatory that had just questioned her knowledge. Professor Thornton finally exhaled slowly, stepping forward with the cautious respect reserved for someone whose reputation had suddenly expanded beyond expectation. "You were on the international circuit," he said, his voice thoughtful. "Vienna, Chicago, Boston, if I remember correctly. Then you disappeared." Lillian offered a small, calm smile, the kind that suggested she had long ago accepted the curiosity that followed her past. "Life sometimes asks a person to change tempo," she said gently. The recital hall remained silent, but the quality of the silence had changed. Moments earlier it had been uncertainty. Now it was reverence. Several donors who had attended countless performances across the country looked at one another with astonishment. One older patron whispered softly, "I still have her recording of Rachmaninoff. I thought she had retired forever." Madame Du Bois stepped closer to the piano, her earlier authority replaced by a rare humility. "Why did you come here and say nothing?" she asked quietly. Lillian rested her hand lightly on the edge of the piano bench before answering. "Because music does not always belong on a stage," she replied. "Sometimes it belongs in quiet places where students are still learning to listen." Her eyes moved gently across the hall, pausing briefly on Gregory Palmer, who still stood near the side of the stage looking both embarrassed and deeply thoughtful. She had noticed the pressure he carried even before the recital began. Talent, she understood, could become fragile when surrounded by expectation and pride. Gregory finally stepped forward, his voice careful but sincere. "Miss Hart. Miss Porter. I did not realize." Lillian raised a hand slightly, stopping his apology before it formed. "You do not need to explain," she said kindly. "Every musician struggles with the same lesson at some point. The music is never about proving you are the best. It is about serving the composer honestly." The words settled gently into the room, more powerful than any lecture. Madame Du Bois closed her eyes briefly, absorbing the quiet wisdom in that statement. For years she had pushed students toward perfection with relentless intensity. Yet the woman standing before her had demonstrated something deeper than technical mastery. Humility, discipline, respect for the art itself. Slowly the first applause began near the back of the hall. It started with a single donor, then another, until the entire room rose in a standing ovation that echoed warmly through the conservatory. But Lillian did not bow like a returning star. She simply inclined her head politely, as if the applause belonged not to her, but to the music that had finally been heard the way it was meant to be. The standing ovation continued for several long seconds, filling the recital hall with a warmth that felt both celebratory and reflective. Yet in the center of the stage, Lillian Hart remained calm and composed, her hands resting lightly at her sides, as if the moment belonged to someone else entirely. The amber lights above the grand piano cast a gentle glow across the polished wood floor, and for a brief moment the Robertson Conservatory seemed to breathe together as one room. Professor Thornton stepped forward first, his usual academic confidence softened by genuine admiration. "Miss Hart," he said carefully, "I believe tonight our conservatory has been given a lesson that no curriculum could ever teach." Several faculty members nodded quietly, their earlier assumptions now replaced by deep respect. But it was Gregory Palmer who carried the heaviest expression of reflection. The young pianist walked slowly toward the center of the stage, his shoulders no longer tense with the pressure that had consumed him earlier in the evening. When he stopped a few feet from Lillian, his voice was steady but sincere. "I thought music was about proving I deserved to be here," he admitted. "Tonight I realized I have been trying to impress people instead of understanding the composer." Lillian looked at him with the gentle patience of someone who had once faced the same realization. "That lesson arrives for every serious musician," she replied softly. "The stage can make a person believe the applause is the goal, but the real goal is honesty with the music. When you play with humility, the audience hears something deeper than skill." Her words settled into the hall like quiet wisdom carried on a familiar melody. Madame Du Bois approached next, her normally commanding presence now touched with rare humility. For years she had built her reputation on discipline and authority, yet tonight a simple demonstration had reminded her that greatness often moves quietly. "Miss Hart," she said with measured sincerity, "our students would benefit greatly from your guidance, if you were ever willing to share it." Lillian considered the request for a moment, glancing once more at the grand piano that had once carried her across the world. Then her gaze shifted toward the rows of students standing along the aisle, young musicians still searching for their own voices. "I never truly stopped teaching," she said gently. "I simply chose a quieter classroom." A small smile appeared on Professor Thornton's face as understanding settled in. The assistant who organized sheet music and prepared rehearsal spaces had been guiding students in subtle ways all along, offering small pieces of advice, adjusting a score here and there, encouraging patience where frustration once lived. The applause had faded now, but the feeling in the room remained strong and clear. As the donors slowly gathered their coats and the audience prepared to leave, Many of them glanced once more toward the stage where the quiet woman stood beside the piano. Some recognized the legendary performer she once had been. Others simply recognized something rarer. True dignity does not need an introduction. And that night, in a hall filled with ambition and expectation, everyone present was reminded of a simple truth that would stay with them long after the music faded. The greatest artists are not the loudest voices in the room. They are the ones who understand that respect for the craft will always speak louder than pride.